Order the Finance Committee meeting of Monday, February 13th, 2023, and ask staff to please call the roll.
Council President Furman.
Present.
Alder Carter.
Present.
Alder Verveer.
Here.
Alder Vitever.
Present.
Alder Figueroa Cole.
Here.
Alder Evers.
Here.
Mayor of quorum.
Thank you. We have no registrants for public comment. So are there any disclosures or recusals on today's agenda? Seeing none, we'll move on to the consent agenda. Are there items that alders would like to have removed from the consent agenda? President Furman.
Item number 18, please.
Item 18. Are there other items? Alder Verveer.
Mike, thank you, Mayor. I have a quick comment on agenda item number 2, please.
Item number 2. All right, so items 2 and 18 will be excluded from the consent agenda. Are there other items that alders wish to have excluded from the consent agenda? Going once. Going twice. President Furman, a motion, please.
Move approval of consent agenda excluding items number 2 and 18.
Second.
Moved and seconded to adopt the consent agenda. Is there any objection to recording a unanimous vote in favor? Seeing no objection, we'll record a unanimous vote in favor of balance of items and take up item number 2, which is Legistar 75923, in which I am pleased to submit to you the reappointment of Charlie Romines for both Streets Superintendent and Public Works Team Leader. President Furman, a motion?
Move approval.
Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded to approve. Alder Verveer has comments. Are there any questions? President Furman.
Quick question about the Public Works Team Leader. Since my short term in the city, it hasn't always been the streets superintendent. Obviously, this is a clear sign that this is something that we wish to have be the case for the next 5 years. Or is there a chance that that might change in a few years if things change?
So it is specific, I think, to the person, not to the position. So in the past, it had been, it actually had been the city engineer, and before that, I think it was the street superintendent. And before that, it was the engineer. Before that, anyway. So it's been back and forth. But if it's me making the appointment, it would be Charlie getting appointed. If Charlie decides to leave us at some point, please don't do that, Charlie. Then I think we would look at the whole Public Works team again.
Got it. I appreciate that. And I have no objections to that. I was just curious how that works. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. Other questions? If not, Alder Verveer.
Thank you again, Mayor. Well, first and foremost, I just want to congratulate and thank Charlie. I know I speak for all of us to say what a true pleasure it is to work with you, Charlie, and thank you for re-upping for another 5 years. Your work, I think, really is remarkable on so many levels. I did want to mention, as I was reviewing the couple of, well, one's the official appointment agreement and the other is the team leader addendum, that there were a couple of erroneous phrases used. So if I could just quickly mention, and I don't know if that's worthy of having Erin and her colleagues in HR do quick corrections or not, but I noticed on the bottom of page 2 that it states that Charlie will serve as the executive secretary of the Solid Waste Advisory Committee And as many of us are aware, we abolished the Solid Waste Advisory Committee actually before the pandemic. So it's been a few years now. And then I noticed in the addendum, the team leader addendum, that it refers to the streets division as the streets and sanitation division. And I know that one day we're going to update the division name to include urban forestry officially, but anyway, I don't think streets and sanitation will be the future name of the division. So I just thought I'd mention those two items that I noticed when I was reviewing the employment agreements. Thank you, and thanks again, Mayor, for reappointing Charlie, and Charlie for agreeing to stick with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Alder Verveer. We appreciate your thoroughness. Other comments, questions? Seeing none, it's been moved and seconded. Is there objection to recording a unanimous vote in favor? Seeing no objection, we'll record that unanimous vote. And let me add my thanks as well, Charlie. And we'll see you at council.
Very good. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
And then that will take us to item 18, which is Legistar 75964, amending the 2023 adopted operating budget to allocate additional funding to the fire department for the purpose of expanding the CARES program and further reducing the Common Council budget. President Furman, a motion.
Move to place on file without prejudice.
All right, the motion is to place on file without prejudice. Is there a second?
Second.
All right. Let's start then with questions. Or perhaps the maker of the motion would like to speak to it.
Sure, happy to. Jumping to where I'd like this to go personally, obviously, so if this fails, we can go back to an approval motion. To be clear, there were some weird issues with the agenda previously from finance when we didn't do it this way. I obviously have been a huge supporter of the CARES program, have supported budget amendments for the CARES program, and I'm very appreciative of said program, but don't wish to spend this money in the council budget on anything at this point. So this is nothing directed towards the CARES program. I just don't support spending that money. Thanks.
Is there further discussion? Seeing none, the motion is to place on file without prejudice. Is there objection to recording unanimous vote in favor? Alder Evers and Alder Vitiver would like to be recorded as voting no. Alder Evers?
Roll call, please.
Alder Evers requests a roll call. So all those in favor of placing on file without prejudice, aye. Those opposed, no, as your name is called. And I'll ask Dave to please call the roll.
Council President Furman,
Aye.
Alder Carter,
Abstain.
Oh,
Alder Verveer,
No.
Alder Vitiver,
No.
Alder Figueroa Cole,
Aye.
Alder Evers,
no.
there's 2 ayes, 3 noes, and 1 abstain.
With 3 noes, the motion fails. And we're back to the item before us. Alder Evers? President,
Move approval of the original motion.
Second.
moved and seconded to approve. Is there a discussion, Alder Evers?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Back in November, when we were working on the budget during our council deliberations of the budget, I put forth the amendment to the executive budget that would have allocated $200,000 for the expansion of CARES. I later put forth an amendment to that, or a substitute, reducing it to $100,000 in the hopes that my colleagues would be convinced of the good reasons for increasing alder pay for that very specific purpose. As we all know, that did not pass, and we have this money in the budget. And so looking for an appropriate way to move forward. And with my comments, I suppose we should also allow some questions to staff. And if the mayor and my colleagues would approve, I'd like to turn this over to Jay Stedman to explain exactly the rationale for an expansion an addition of a third CARES team during peak hours of 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. And the reason for that, essentially, so many calls that the CARES team currently cannot answer. So if it would be okay with you, Mayor, and my colleagues, I wonder if Assistant Chief Stedman could speak to this motion.
Thank you, Alder. Is there any objection to going back to questions for staff? Seeing none. Assistant Chief Stedman.
Thank you, Mayor. So the results of our annual report and the data that came out of that, I think one important point to remember is that there are over 50% of the anticipated mental health calls during those peak hours that the fire department is possibly missing, that the two CARES teams that are in service are missing because they're on other calls. And that was why we asked for that third team during peak hours in the fourth quarter of this year. But we know that currently there are calls being missed. So without going into a whole lot more detail and not going through all the data in the report, I guess I would just open it up to questions. It's just a matter of us not being able to respond to all the calls that we could possibly respond to at the current time.
And Assistant Chief Stedman, could you please, when you say that you would be able to start this third team in April, I mentioned from my conversation with you, you indicated it would be during the peak hours from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. Can you talk about how we identify the peak hours and how this third team would be deployed a little bit more specifically, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the identification of the peak hours are just purely looking at the data from our call volume that comes from the 911 center. The process for making that happen, currently we're in an open hiring process for another community paramedic for the current expansion that is to add hours to the weekends. So right now we're in an open process. We can just add an extra hire to that process if we were approved to add the expansion of the peak hours as well. So that would be one more community paramedic hire, but it would also be one more Journey Mental Health hire on top of the one that we're currently hiring for. So because we're currently in the hiring process, it would be feasible for us to just hire the extra people now and start. April 1st is a soft date. That's what we expect to be able to accomplish with expanding into the weekend, and we could do the same thing essentially with the third team during peak hours.
And to be clear, Assistant Chief Stedman, this is not being imposed upon you. This isn't Alder Evers trying to come up with a reason to spend this money. This is a perceived need. And when these calls don't get responded to, what happens to these individuals? Do we have some idea? Are these just unmet needs in our community then?
Well, any time that the CARES team is either not available because they're on other calls or they're simply not in service, those calls for service go back to the police department and they're handled as appropriately as possible by Madison Police. I can't give you any data on what happens with those individuals versus what happens with the CARES individuals at this time. But yeah, those calls for service go back to the police department.
And lastly, Assistant Chief Stedman, I recall during previous budget deliberations, it was either you or Chief Carbon who indicated, or perhaps our previous chief indicated that there was a hope at some point to establish CARES as its own agency. Do you see this as appropriate next step towards getting us toward a more full service agency?
I'd have a hard time commenting on that, Alder Evers, to be honest. I think moving CARES into its own agency, I would imagine we're quite a ways away from that. When Chief Davis, the previous chief, spoke about that, that was more of like in my opinion, a 5-year vision rather than something that we're trying to do anytime soon.
Nonetheless, do you see this as an appropriate next step in the evolution of the CARES program?
Yes, a team during peak hours is what we consider to be the appropriate next expansion after weekend hours.
Thank you so much. No further questions.
Thank you, Alder. Are there other questions, Alder Vitever?
I am not sure if we have anybody from MPD on, but Mike, maybe you can comment just from what you've heard from your colleagues at MPD. I guess what I want to understand is what impact has the implementation and to date expansion of the CARES team had on the morale of our police officers in knowing that they have this other team out there responding to some of the calls that may have been very difficult for them in the past?
Yeah, great question. So we've been on approximately 1,800 calls now. So we can say that, we've diverted 1,800 calls from the police department. And just the kind of general anecdotal feedback that we get is that the Madison Police Department, especially the patrol officers, are happy to have CARES as a resource on the streets, right? Not just to reduce their operational stress, but because they understand as well that these folks are getting hopefully the most important care. But yeah, I haven't been involved in any conversations where a single Madison police officer says this is a horrible idea. So I guess that's the best anecdote I can provide. But yeah, the feedback has been great from the police department, and they've partnered with us from the beginning. They've been part of the planning process for all of this. So they've been very well aware of which direction we've been going, and they've been very supportive.
And so those 1,800 calls that CARES has responded to are also 1,800 calls that Madison Police haven't responded to, and therefore they have that additional then capacity to respond to other things. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Alder. Alder Evers, is your hand still up from previously?
Not for questions, but we're back to this discussion, yes.
Okay, let me see if there's any other questions first. Seeing no other questions, thank you, Che.
You're welcome.
And then we'll move into discussion. Alder Evers.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I think it's clear that all of us on council see the importance of CARES and this initiative primarily as a means of being able to address the ongoing concern that we ask our police department to do too much. And that by relieving MPD of the burden of addressing mental health crises, we free up our sworn officers to do what they do best. The rhetoric around reimagining police and public safety, we've all heard it many times. So this is a vote to be able to expand something we know to be very good. Regarding keeping this money within the council budget, we currently still need to hire the legislative assistant or the legislative staff person. We don't have any clear idea of how this $91,000 could be spent. It's been debated, but we have a very clear idea how 81,000 of this or 82,000 of this 91,000 could be spent, and how it would resolve unless armed police officers showing up at a mental health crisis. To me, this makes a lot of sense, and I'd ask my colleagues to support it accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Alder. Is there further discussion? Alder Carter?
Thank you, Mayor. I'm a bit conflicted here because I felt very deeply that hiring another investigator for DCR was extremely important for our 6,000 new residents. And yet it wasn't important enough. And thus far, we have reallocated money to CARES, and CARES is extremely important. I get it. But we seem not to feel that the basics, civil rights, is important. So I'm very conflicted on this, and I won't be supporting it.
Thank you, Alder. Is there further discussion? Seeing no further discussion, the motion is to adopt. All those in favor of adoption, aye. Those opposed, no, as your name is called. And Dave will please call the roll.
Council President Furman,
No.
Alder Carter,
No.
Alder Verveer,
Aye.
Alder Vitiver,
Aye.
Alder Figueroa Cole,
No.
Alder Evers,
Aye.
Mayor, that's 3 ayes, 3 noes.
With 3 ayes and 3 noes, the motion fails. And that is the balance of our agenda. I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move adjournment.
Second.
Moved and seconded to adjourn. Is there any objection to recording unanimous vote in favor? Seeing no objection, we are adjourned. Thank you all. Have a good night.